What's the value of learning biblical Hebrew? I just had a great interview with Catherine McDowell. She wrote a book called The Rewards of Learning Greek and Hebrew. This is such a fantastic book where she gives real, deep, substantive examples that will encourage and inspire you to keep at it with learning Hebrew. And even if you're the type of person who you've decided you're not learning Hebrew, there are great examples of biblical exegesis from this book that you can copy and paste into your preaching and in your teaching. This was a great interview, a wonderful conversation. I'm excited to introduce you to Catherine McDowell. So let's dive into today's episode. All right. Well, Dr. Catherine McDowell, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm really excited to talk about this book. I loved getting to read this, and this is going to be a really valuable resource for a lot of people who are passionate about languages. But before we dive in, just in case someone maybe isn't familiar with you or your work, I wonder if you could just give a little introduction to you.
Sure. Well, I teach Hebrew and Old Testament courses at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. Our home campus, or our original campus, is up in Massachusetts, but we also have a campus in Charlotte. So I teach there. I've been there about 10 years, and it's been a wonderful experience. I love working with graduate students. But in addition to teaching there, I've been teaching, just recently started teaching at a seminary in Haiti, in northern Haiti, the city of Milo, of the foundation, a foundation called Pierre Smith Mondeleu, FPSM, Foundation Pierre Smith Mondeleu. It's a mouthful.
That is a mouthful.
Has started both a primary school and a seminary. And we just finished our first semester, and the students, their first course was Hebrew. So I was privileged to be able to do that through Zoom. And it's been very life-giving to me to be able to meet with them and to see their eagerness and their enthusiasm. These are all pastors, about 22 pastors, whose lives are quite difficult. And so they're making a significant sacrifice to study. But their enthusiasm is just keeps me going. Yeah.
Wow. That's super cool. That's a great mission work to do. You impact a lot of people. Another question I want to ask you was, how specifically did you get into biblical and ancient languages? And at what point did it really click for you that you thought, this is something that I really love, I care about this, and I want this to be a part of my life, my career?
Great question. So it's really part of my personal testimony. I became a Christian when I was 12.
Okay.
And really was interested from that point on in what the Bible had to say. And I had never planned on going into Old Testament studies. My passion was really kind of Western Civ, European art history, and history in general, European history. And so I thought seminary will be a bit of a detour, just because I'm a Christian, but I really don't understand what I believe. And so for me, seminary was a time when I thought, okay, I'm really going to just take this 3-year hiatus and focus on scripture, and then go back to European history and art history. But once I started studying, my very first class in seminary was with, he's only well known in small circles, but a man named Meredith Klein. And it really bowled me over. It was the first time I had been introduced to the ancient Near Eastern context of the Old Testament. And it really was a life-changing course for me. So that's when the tide began to turn. And I thought, maybe I really want to focus on Old Testament. And then I just had such wonderful language teachers at Gordon Conwell. And then it was the exegesis that got me so excited. I really was stunned by what I was learning in a great way, excited about what I was learning. And I think studying biblical language is one of the most undersold ways of spiritual formation. And it really was forming, both in that, it's not so easy to learn these languages, and you do it with, I made good friends in these classes that we study together, friends to this day, actually. But delving into God's word in depth like that was really transforming. And so I just thought, I love this. I want to do more of this. And, a lot of people would think, well, grammar and syntax, not very exciting in any language. But even for those who may not be excited by that initially, once you start to delve into it and see how that impacts your understanding of the text, It's just so exciting.
Yeah, I
And
couldn't agree more. That's been my story, and I did not originally learn these languages because I thought I would get a career out of it or because I would use it in the space I was in. I just found it personally for me transformative and a great experience. And ultimately, language I feel like is a bridge to people and ideas that you otherwise don't have access to. And so when you get, whether it's a modern language or ancient languages to connect to the Bible and the surrounding cultures. That's been my story. And I think a lot of people listen to this podcast, they have that value. We're all at different points in our language journey, whether we haven't learned anything yet or we know a lot, but at least we value and we know that this does matter.
yeah,
Um, so you've obviously used a lot of really, I mean, top-notch scholarship exegesis in your work that you've done. But now this year, you've kind of taken a different type of book to write, which I love this, The Rewards of Learning Greek and Hebrew, to help inspire other people to
Mhm.
do this. I would love to just hear a little bit of the story. How did this project come to be? What's the background behind this?
Yeah, so I wish I could take credit for it, but I can't. I was approached by Amy Paulson Reed at Hendrickson Publishers, and I'm sure Jonathan Klein, also at Hendrickson, had something to do with it. And they asked me if I wanted to do something like this. And I said, I would love to do something like this because I could easily come up with a long list of possible topics very quickly, just because it's the kind of thing I use in class all the time, my Hebrew classes. And so it really was their brainchild. But I was thrilled to be able to participate, to be asked to do it.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So in this book, by the way, I guess it's good to note for anyone listening that there's half is Hebrew, half's Greek.
Mhm.
So today we're going to focus on the Hebrew part, but a great book for people interested in, the two main biblical languages. So you go over, maybe you can give us just a brief little overview. We basically have like your 10 chapters or so,
Yes,
just the big picture. So maybe we can dive into an example or two
sure.
from this.
So yeah, the chapters are only about 1,000 words apiece, and so
Yep.
it's nice that you can read something and be through the chapter quickly. The chapters don't necessarily build on one another, so
Mhm.
you can skip around or you can pick it up and put it down.
Yep.
But yeah, so what I try to focus on is not to convince people that, if you're reading an English Bible, you're not really understanding scripture. I think
Mhm.
that's too strong of a statement.
Yep. Yep.
Our translations are wonderful and reliable, but what I'm trying to show people is what you're missing by not reading it in Hebrew or not
Mhm.
reading the Old Testament in Hebrew. And so um, I'm trying to kind of persuade people that the investment is worth it. And so um, I've been influenced a lot by Robert Alter,
Mhm.
who is very famous for his books on Hebrew narrative and Hebrew poetry.
Yep.
And he really opened my eyes to a lot of the literary devices that biblical authors use to make their rich theological points. And so a lot of what I've done is that kind of thing, looking at how the grammar and syntax, like the message is not just encoded in the words.
Mhm.
The message is even embedded at the level of syntax and grammar. And so if you really want to understand an author's message, you really do have to know something about that
Yep.
and understand it. And you can get, a sufficient basic knowledge in a year. You could spend your life, of course, lifetime
Right.
studying Hebrew, but you can get some good solid basics in a year, enough to kind of propel you into this. Things like the use of puns.
Mhm.
I love the prophetic insults when it comes to idolatry, and just
Yes.
some of them are just really funny and sharp and stinging, and it really is lost in translation because
Mhm.
the translators in some cases aren't. I mean, some of what the prophet says get a little bit racy or a
Mm.
little bit, a little
Yeah, it's
rough.
it's edgy.
Yeah, it's edgy, and so
Yeah.
they'll smooth it out in English, and you really do lose the force behind it.
Yep.
It's not just that it's interesting, but one of the things I tell my students constantly is, we don't want to preach and teach our own agenda. We really want to
Mm.
understand the author's agenda, the human
Mm.
author, and ultimately God as the author of scripture, and get behind that and promote that rather than our own. And in order to do that, you just have to pay attention to what the author's agenda is, which is embedded in not just the words, but the syntax, the grammar, the artful arrangement of things.
Yep.
I have a chapter on fronting. It's one of my favorite topics.
Yep.
And not in every case is a change in normal word order done for emphasis, but a lot of times it is.
Yeah.
And when I started going through my English Bibles, I was stunned at how often that word order is switched in order to make it sound a little smoother in
Yeah.
English. But by doing that, they've lost the emphasis. And again, when you notice that emphasis, an unusual word order or something, that's a big clue in terms of preaching and teaching that text.
Yeah.
So it just pains me sometimes that gets lost.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. It's ironic. I just came from a meeting where we were talking about fronting with some
Mhm.
Hebrew in there. And one of the
Yeah.
ones you talk about is just the use of the pronoun
Mhm.
before verbs, where the idea that in English, it's very normal to have subject, verb, we move on. Like I know, I love, I do, you do, whatever. Very normal. Whereas a lot of times in Hebrew, you don't even need any pronoun whatsoever. The fact that it's present is emphasis, and the fact that it's at the front. But in English, that's a difficult thing to do because if we just translate literally piece by piece, that's
Yeah.
just normal English, and we
Yes.
miss that emphasis.
Yeah. And it really can be quite significant. I'm thinking off the top of my head, but like in Isaiah, the idol parodies in Isaiah,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's either 44 or 46, but it says Baal stoops down, Nebo stoops over. And the thing is, God's talking about his people going into exile because of their idolatry.
Mm-hmm.
And they're lifting up these idols and carrying them. But he says, I am the one who has carried you. And it's ani espol. So it's that pronoun emphasis, which again, like you said, was not necessary. But in English, we don't pick that up. It's not there. It's the emphasis is not there in our Bibles. And again, I just think that's a clue to us as to the emphasis in the text. And if we want to preach and teach it, then, if at all possible, it's so worth learning these languages to pick up things that go beyond, oh, that's neat or that's catchy. No, this is really significant stuff here.
Yeah. In fact, that's one of the things I really like about this is you give substantive examples. It's not just fun facts. That's cool or interesting. And I'm all for, I'm a nerd. I'm all for the cool and interesting.
Right.
It doesn't have to be a game changer every time.
Right.
But at the end of the day, for a lot of people, it's, we're in this because of the transformative value. And we understand there are times when we're preaching, teaching, learning. We want to see how does this impact the way we do things. So you've already kind of touched on some. I wonder if is there maybe one chapter you can give us just a little bit of a taste for maybe another example or two in your book that you do.
Aside from fronting, how about the prophetic sarcasm? Give an example of that.
Yep.
So as you well know, Matthew, there's a lot of Hebrew vocabulary is pretty rich when it comes to idolatry.
Yes.
Right? A lot of different words for idolatry, and their semantic range certainly overlaps, but they're not all identical. And so it is significant to know which term an author is actually using because it just has a different nuance or emphasis. But one of my favorite ones, I have to say, is find it. It's the one where so the prophets use these derogatory terms, right? And in some cases, like I said, the English Bibles are kind of reticent to translate them exactly because some of them can be quite graphic. But Ezekiel will even refer to idols as, and I'll use an appropriate word, maybe dung.
Yeah.
Okay. but if it was, I don't know how like the Living Bible translates it, but he's being quite graphic there if you read in Hebrew.
Yeah.
But some of the other ones are things like, and it may be in a different chapter, but there's
that Ezekiel one's a great example. I mean, like you mentioned, that in Ezekiel, this word for idol is used. I haven't counted them, but it's a lot of times. This is just a good example for anyone. If you're preaching out of Ezekiel, knowing this is super helpful instead of realizing this isn't just another word for idol, that you see dozens of other places in the Bible. He's using a uniquely graphic, very direct, intense word that gets the point across.
But there's a point at which I think it's in Kings, but where the author is talking about Baal Ramon. So Baal, the god Baal.
Yeah.
And in Akkadian, his name was Baal Rahman, I believe. No, maybe it was Ugaritic. Anyway, his name was Baal Rahman, but the biblical author uses the same set of consonants, but changes the vowels to Baal Ramon.
Yeah.
And so he changes his name. Instead of Lord, like the Thunderer, he's Lord of the Pomegranate.
I love that.
It just
Yeah, I didn't know
completely
that.
reduces him to,
Yep.
nothing, a pomegranate.
Yeah.
It's funny. It is. And
Yes.
I think the biblical audience, the original audience would have thought that was funny because the author's
Yep.
really poking fun at the idol. But that one seems to be a bit more playful, but in most cases they're pretty sharp and stinging and
Yep.
in the way they address idolatry. And again, I think how that translates for us is it's easy for us to preach or teach on a passage about idolatry, but how often do we do it with that kind of almost like vehemence?
Yes.
True. And so I do think like that should be carried over into our teaching and preaching, that prophetic attitude towards these things is part of what we really need to pick up on.
Yeah, that's excellent. I love that example. I found that so fun. I think that's probably one that does any Bible translation actually try to translate it, or is it always transliterated where it's just
always
the
remember in the ones I've seen. Now, I think there may be footnotes which explain it. I know the ESV Archaeology Study Bible, because I wrote the notes for Kings. I explained it, but that's, I think, oh, what a terrible thing to miss if you're reading through this.
How fun. You go from the thunder to the pomegranate, exactly. Just a little something thrown for a smoothie. I find that's pretty funny. Exactly. One thing I really appreciate how you do in this book, it's amazing, like you said, less than 1,000 words each chapter, is you give really substantive examples from biblical language knowledge. You communicate in a meaningful way. It's engaging, it's clear, and then we're done. We move on. And I think for a lot of people, they're studying biblical languages because they don't just want the personal edification, they also want to share with others. But that can be difficult to do. I know for me personally, my major was communication when I did my undergrad. And so I worked in that career space before I moved on to my master's degree. And so while I enjoyed communication, was great, whenever I got into the academic realm, starting to learn about academic biblical literature and languages, on one hand, I was very excited, loved what I was learning, but then I found I became a worse communicator.
Yeah.
Like I was like, man, I don't think I was engaging. People were kind of confused, and I've had to grow and learn, and still in my own journey, figuring out how do I do this in a way where I take the knowledge I'm finding. I feel it in my study, but now I'm trying to actually come across in a way it's helpful to people. It's engaging. So you model it really well in your book. Can you give us a little more behind the scenes for people who are wanting to do this well? Do you have any tips or thoughts?
Yeah, sure. That's something I struggled with as well, because in grad school, you're not trained to write that way. You're trained to be very technical and really just communicate with the guild. So I did struggle initially with other things I was working on in the past, like how do I communicate this to a lay audience? But I have done a lot of lay teaching in the church. And so I've just had, over the years, just gained some experience in how to do that. And I had the exact same experience that you described, where I would teach a class and then think, oh, okay, it was too technical. It was kind of missed the mark. So I don't know of a better way, a quicker way, but over time, with practice, I was able to do that. And I also worked on a study Bible project. I mentioned the ESV Archaeology Study Bible. So I did the notes for Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. And that also forced me to write simply.
Yep.
And so, I think it's just something that over time, with practice, you can do. And then I had some good models as well. One of my colleagues, Carol Kaminsky, she has a PhD in Old Testament from Cambridge, but she also is just excellent at communicating both in the academic world, but also in the church and in lay settings, and with her next door neighbor, who was not a believer. And so I've learned from her, and also just in reading her work, she's been a good example to me of how to communicate without losing the substance, but to communicate in a way that's clear and intelligible to folks. And I also sometimes will ask my family members
Yeah.
who are not Bible scholars to read something.
Yep. That's great.
Feedback. Yeah.
I totally resonate with everything you just said. Yeah, the experience, the practice, and just asking for feedback is so helpful. But I think for some people, unfortunately, they almost give up on trying to communicate at all, anything. It's just, you know, anything using language is too technical. Just forget about it. Don't even try. I mean, I don't know if you've run into that for people.
Yes, I have. And I was really blessed to have a pastor when I was a seminary student who happened to be an Old Testament scholar as well. And so he also did a really good job, I thought, on Sunday mornings of preaching. It's great substance. And I knew where he was drawing something, but he didn't say things like, well, in Hebrew, da, 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 da. He didn't need to do that.
Yeah.
So I had a good model in that. But I would encourage people just to push, like if you're someone who has studied Greek and Hebrew and you really want to be able to communicate this to a wider audience, you just have to push through that awkward phase. And like I said, practice and feedback, and be willing to not be the best speaker, perhaps, or not be the best communicator for a while. And in time, you will improve.
That's good. That's really helpful. One other thing I enjoy in this book is it's filled with wonderful quotes from everyone from, seasoned scholars to undergraduate students and their perspective on language, the language learning journey, what value they found from it. I wonder if you could just share maybe one in the book that you find striking. And just talk about
it's hard to pick one because there's quite a variety. And it was fun. I agree. It was really fun to read those. From some of them were at least one or two of them were my students.
Oh, cool.
But most of them were not, and it was just really fun to hear from them. But I really did love what Chip Hardy had to say on page 23. He says, we would do well to approach our ancient neighbors with a mind open to understanding the world on their own terms, if we would hope to understand the truth of their words. And I think that's something, in grad school, seminary, or PhD program, you're taught to do that. But in terms of the church, it's not something that, at least in my experience, I would ever hear much about. And it's true for most of my students too. I always teach OT survey every fall. And I love teaching it because it's full of students who it's their first class in seminary and they're eager. But and I have a pretty heavy ancient Near Eastern emphasis in my Old Testament survey course, and it's all new to them. And for some of them, it's threatening. For others, it's exciting and it really opens things up. But I think, we wouldn't treat other texts this way. So why do we treat the Bible this way and assume that we don't really need to know anything about that ancient context or the ancient authors or the ancient literary conventions in order to understand it? Of course we do.
Wow.
But it's accessible. It's something we can do. You don't have to have a master's degree to be able to do it if you're willing to roll up your sleeves and read a book.
Wow. So, that's good. Very challenging, very important. Absolutely love it. I remember first being taught with the ancient Near East opened my world tremendously. That's phenomenal. So I wonder then, what's something for someone listening who they're somewhere in this journey. Maybe they're at the beginning, maybe they're somewhere in the middle, and they're continuing to try to strive forward. But maybe they feel a little more discouraged than excited in this current moment. They feel a little more guilt, let's say, when they're sermon prepping or when they're trying to write that paper. They don't feel as good as their fellow students. Any kind of encouragement you would give people as they're trying to pursue biblical languages, understanding the ancient Near East culture aspects? What thoughts would you have for them?
Yes. I would say it's not something that comes quickly or easily to anyone, I would say, unless you have a photographic memory, which I do not have. It's a challenge, right? It's work. But I would encourage people to just pace yourself. You're going to progress at a rate that may be different from your classmate or your pastor friend or something, and that's fine. But the kind of steady faithfulness will really pay off. You don't have to become a Hebrew scholar and an ancient scholar before you preach next week. Think of it more in terms of, have some small goals. This year I'd like to read this book and maybe cover this many chapters in Hebrew or something. So it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And you would be surprised if you pace yourself and just be faithful. In a few years, you really have managed to learn a significant amount of material that has both transformed you and your approach to scripture and even your relationship with the Lord, believe it or not.
Yeah.
And therefore it brings so much more to your students or to your congregation. So think in terms of the long haul. I know that's not, we need that kind of, we like instant gratification, but
Sure.
this is definitely not that.
Yep.
That's what, this book is designed to do. And there are other things out there as well that to encourage students and people studying, to support them. And I think for me, one of the most important things was having a friend to do it with. So I had classmates, but I actually always had a study partner in every language course I took. And that paid rich dividends. Relationally, we're still friends to this day,
That's
but
cool.
also just in terms of learning and encouraging each other. So I think it's really hard to do it alone.
Yep.
But I'd recommend at least pairing up with one other person, if not maybe two.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah, life is better together, doing with people.
Yeah.
This actually kind of segues as well to one question I wanted to ask. I'm a big behind the scenes person. I love getting to see whether how things are made, or, what do great people do behind the scenes? Because we all know behind any great movie, you have actors who are slaving away at their work and their craft. Any great author, there's a process. So I guess for the sake of a wide audience, I might ask this in two ways. One for either more the beginning person, or even someone, but also for like the super advanced who they're trying to keep climbing. Any tactics or habits that you found helpful? You already kind of listed a couple. Are there any others that you would give for someone trying to really get great at languages?
Yeah, I mean, people's learning styles do differ. But there are, on one hand, there are some really good kind of basic tools that are available online that are useful in Quizlet and Memrise. I created, just for an example, full vocab sets with audio that goes with the textbook I use. I did not write the textbook, but the one I use, and I just made them free to people, and others have done that too. So there's those kind of things. And when I created those, it was the first time in about 8 years, I didn't have students complain to me about vocabulary and how do I learn vocabulary? Okay. So that apparently has made a big difference. Yeah. So there's that kind of thing when it's kind of early on in the process. But again, what I tell my students is don't plan to kind of try to cram it all in on the weekends. A lot of my students work either part-time or full-time. I said, learning a language is something that is more of a daily discipline. So putting in an hour and a half a day is how you're going to learn it, not let me study for 4 or 5 hours.
Yeah.
Again, unless you're just really exceptional
Sure.
on a Saturday. And so, again, I think of one year I brought into my class on the first day of Hebrew, a stuffed rabbit and a stuffed turtle, and told the story of the tortoise and the hare, which most of my students were familiar with. And I said, you just got to be the tortoise in this case.
Yeah.
Because inevitably I have students that just don't believe me, and then they end up failing the first semester and have to repeat it the following year. It really is a marathon, not a sprint. And so, daily discipline. And I was just talking with a student recently, it takes me so long to get through this many verses. And she's someone who has finished her Hebrew and wants to just maintain it. And I said, well, rather than saying I have to get through X many verses a day, say, I'm going to just spend 30 minutes. And I just get as far as I get.
Yep.
If that's 3 verses, if it's 5 verses, and then over time, she'll, gain more facility and she'll be able to do more in 30 minutes. But I do think the slow, steady pace is what really pays off. And studying in community. And then there are a lot of helpful resources that are available either at little cost or no cost in terms of books and lectures and videos and other
That's,
things.
that's great. I think in your book, I think you give a number of QR codes
Yes.
of helpful resources for people. I mean, there's never been a better time to learn languages, I think, with all the resources that are available.
Great. Wow.
So this question that I want to ask you is, how do I put this? Obviously, the church and the academic realm and the world just needs more people who are choosing to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to pursue biblical languages. It's going to be a part of what I do. But also, I think about maybe a pastor is a good example for this. There's some, though, where there's a lot to do. There's not just the preaching, but there's pastoral care and there's finances, leadership. For some people, maybe realistically for them, they just know that being good at biblical languages isn't realistic for them, but they still value it and they want to incorporate it in what they do and in how they teach. So I mean, maybe they've learned the alphabet, maybe they've done something. Do you have any advice for someone who says, I value this, but this isn't my thing?
Yeah.
But how can I still incorporate this in my teaching or my preaching?
Sure. And I think that's probably a pretty significant category of people.
Yeah.
In terms of numbers. I was thinking about this, and I think what I would recommend are two things. One is, use quality secondary sources. So it's worth investing some money in having a good library. You don't need an expansive library, but you need some good quality resources. And sometimes it's hard to know, well, what are quality resources? You want to make sure you look at who wrote the article or the book. Where did they study? And you can probably look up, reviews can be helpful, or they can, sometimes they're not that helpful actually, but you want to make sure you're getting work from established scholars who know what they're talking about. And then, I use Bible software every day. And I think it can be a blessing and a curse if you don't know languages, because you look up a word and if you don't have enough to know how to use the tools, it can be a little bit dangerous maybe. But even if you just learn enough Greek or Hebrew, even just a little bit, to be able to use those tools. And those are also really nice ways to build libraries, because you can get sources electronically, which makes it easier to search. But yeah, I would say probably your best bet is to build. Doesn't have to be a huge library, but a quality library.
Yeah. Two comments I'll make on that. The first one is, I think this book that you've written, The Rewards of Learning Greek and Hebrew, is not just good for people who are learning biblical languages, but as alluded to earlier, it's written in such a way where there's substantive content here. It's written already in an engaging, clear way. Really, I think pastors, teachers can copy paste, essentially paragraphs from this into a teaching. Like, for example, we talked about Ezekiel. And if you read that section there, how he talks about idols, you don't need to understand Hebrew well. Catherine explains it really well. And you can just essentially, copy paste that into your message, maybe throw up a slide even throw up a paragraph that she wrote as a slide. So anyway, this is a great resource. Even if someone's saying, you know what, I've been there, I've tried it, I'm just convinced it's not going to be part of my repertoire, I would still recommend this book for people who are looking for a trusted source and saying, how can I incorporate some teaching? You give dozens of examples, not just 10, although there are 10 chapters. Each chapter, you give a lot of examples. There's a lot of material to work with. Second comment I'll make is one of my goals with this podcast is to help introduce people to trusted sources, because for some, this can be a little overwhelming, especially if you didn't go to seminary. How do I navigate this whole world of library? And for some people, there's one thing to look at a book and a name, but it's another thing where you see a face, you hear a voice, you get to hear someone talk. So for the listeners out there, just know Catherine McDowell. If you don't know where to start, here's one person to start with, to add to your library, to add resources for. Excuse me. So the last thing I want to do is a few rapid fire questions. Okay. Speaking of getting to know you, people getting introduced, I just want to ask some fun questions, a couple of Bible related, a couple not, just to get to know you a little better. The first one, I love asking any professor. I know it's really hard, but if you only get to teach 3 classes, that's it. I know you've taught dozens, but 3 subjects, what are they going to be?
Hebrew language, exegesis of Genesis, and probably an ancient Near Eastern history / archaeology course.
Wow, that's a fun lineup. It's good. That's really good.
Or Isaiah.
Once again, it's like, but this one, I love this one.
Yeah. It's hard to list 3.
So once again, it's good that we live in an ideal world where you can teach more than three.
That's right.
So money, time, COVID, none of that's a problem. Where in the world would you want to travel, and what would you want to do?
Yes. So it's funny you asked this, because right before COVID hit, I was planning a study tour. I was starting to create it. We were in the early stages, but where I take students to London, Paris, and Munich, to the British Museum and Library, to the Louvre, and to the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, actually Berlin, not Munich. And I was creating kind of a study tour for seminary students, where we would go to these libraries, these museums that have such major collections of things that have to do with the biblical world. Because just like language being so eye-opening, that ancient Near Eastern context is incredibly eye-opening. But I know that's kind of school related. I do love to travel. I do love going new places. And my daughter actually wants to go to New Zealand.
Okay.
So I told her maybe someday.
Maybe.
That's a pretty expensive trip.
I'm about to say that is.
But,
Lord of the Rings fans, you guys going to go see
yes,
Sure.
Yes, exactly. So I said maybe a study abroad while you're in college, but we'll see.
There you go. Yeah. Another one is, what's a hobby outside of the whole biblical studies, ancient Near East background that you have that you enjoy?
Yeah, so I mentioned traveling. I do love to travel. It's been harder, of course, with COVID, and then I still have kids at home. But I also, especially when I lived in Massachusetts, I was there for a long time. Antiquing was so much fun. So I love ancient material culture, but I love material culture that's only 100 years old.
Yeah, I was about to say, it's fun to see how hobbies correlate. It's still, if you will, ancient material culture.
So I have my favorite antiquing story is Harvard Library, Widener Library at Harvard. They were redoing it while I was there, renovating the whole library. And so they were giving away the study carols, and they were original to the library.
Wow.
They had been purchased by J.P. Morgan in their arts and crafts period desk. And they were just giving them away. And so one of my classmates and I went, and we were the first and second people in line.
No way.
We got whichever desk they pulled out. And so I am actually sitting at it right now. My J.P. Morgan period study carol from Widener Library at Harvard.
That is so cool.
If Antiques Roadshow ever comes to my town, I will take my desk and see what it's worth. But
love it.
It's got a lot of value. Yeah.
That's really special. Okay, just a couple more. What is your favorite book of the Hebrew Bible?
This is also a very difficult question for an Old Testament professor. I've done most of my work in the early chapters of Genesis, and I love that. And it also has been really transformative in terms of, that's the lens through which we read the rest of Scripture. So I do teach a Genesis course, love doing that. But I'm really a Pentateuch and prophets kind of gal. Although I've taught Job at a lay level in my church a couple of times. And now I'm really interested in kind of the theological anthropology in Job. So I may do something with that in the future. But, if I had to pick one, it would probably be Genesis.
Yeah, I'm glad I'm the one asking the question, not giving the answer, because that's really, really tough. So last one is, where can people get your book? And also, if people want to connect more with any of your content, what's the best place for them to go?
Well, I believe the book's online at, Amazon, christianbook.com, and other places. So I think it's pretty easy to find.
Yep.
But I also have a faculty webpage. So if you go to the Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary website, or just Google Gordon Conwell and my name, McDowell, you'll find it. I also have started an Amazon authors page. So some stuff is there. And then the other place I'll upload articles is academia.edu, which is free. Everyone can post articles there. So those are probably the best places to find things.
Excellent. So I'll put links to all of that in the show notes for people to be able to click on. I got to say, this is, and I mean, this is my favorite Hebrew book of 2021. And I say that because I'm very passionate about people getting to learn languages, but But a big pet peeve of mine in any subject is just, all right, guys, we're going to dive in, nitty gritty, just get to work without showing people why do we do this, and let's give you a taste of what you get to experience when you take on that long haul journey.
Yeah.
This is a great example of it. It's concise as well, very easily for anyone. You can pick up, just read a chapter, and it's a great resource. I highly recommend for people. So anyway, thank you so much for coming to the show. It was great getting to have this conversation with you. Hope you have a great new year.
Thank you, Matthew. You as well. I really appreciate the time.